So in my last video, I covered a recent election in American politics, and it seems that every time I do that, something happens here at home that drags me right back into the chaos that we constantly have in our own domestic politics. Because the news of the day is that the South Australian Liberal leader, Vincent Tarzia, has resigned. And his resignation marks the fourth change in Liberal Party leadership across the state and territory branches in as many weeks. So just looking at the scorecard as of late, in New South Wales we had Kelly Sloan, great name by the way, taking over for Mark Speakman, basically just resigning over poor polling. And then a similar situation in Victoria where Brad Batten stepped down, his shadow treasurer Jess Wilson took over also because he wasn't really getting any headway in the polling. And then in the ACT, now you guys don't care. But anyway, it looks like a similar story is happening in South Australia today. It appears that Vincent Tarzia, a man who has really had no success whatsoever in trying to fix the Liberal brand in South Australia, was presented with some internal polling by people in the Liberal Party. And to say it was dire would be the understatement of the century. The South Australian Liberal Party is currently sitting on 13 seats. They are not really in any position to win the upcoming election next year, even if all things were even. It is quite a swing they will need towards them, but apparently internal party polling suggested that they are doing so poorly. Just to give you a point of reference, in South Australia, the polling for next year's election is looking like it's going to be 66-34 in the two-party preferred vote at the end of the day. And apparently Liberal polling had that equaling the South Australian Liberals having maybe 3 seats in the lower house at next year's election. I've done an in-depth breakdown of the state of the South Australian Liberals lately after the most recent poll came out, and it kind of blew everyone's minds about how dire the situation was. But basically, Peter Malinauskas, current Premier of South Australia, incredibly popular, very much a pro-business Labor Premier who's kind of just appealing to pretty much everyone. He's very charismatic, very popular, seen as someone who is actually achieving for the state, and the Liberals really don't have anything to offer. And on top of that, they've had quite a few scandals of their own, including one of their previous leaders during this term of opposition, basically pleading guilty to using cocaine after getting caught on video doing so. And this isn't just a matter of polling. If we also look at actual by-elections in this term of the South Australian Parliament, you will see a pattern here that, the South Australian Liberal Party, to put it as politely as I possibly can, is getting ripped to shit by South Australian voters. And this kind of chain of just disaster after disaster, polling collapse after polling collapse, lost by-election after lost by-election, has just kind of proven to the party that they need a drastic shake-up very soon. To give you a sense of how desperate this decision really is, the 2026 South Australian state election, early voting for that begins in like 100 days. We are very, very, very close to this election campaign properly kicking off. And Tarzia's replacement, who at this point looks very likely to be his shadow health minister, well, she's in all likelihood barely going to have 3 months to put herself forward to the South Australian people and build like a public persona before the election is going to hit like that, which I think really gives you a sense of how absolutely desperate the Liberals are for something to change about the current state of the race. And what I find really interesting is that it seems that the South Australian Liberals are going to go the path of almost exactly what the Victorian Liberals and the New South Wales Liberals did, and that is pick a woman who is a first-term MP to take over for a male leader who is polling very poorly. Now, in South Australia's case, as I mentioned, it looks like the shadow health minister is the presumptive frontrunner to take over for Tarzia, and her name is Ashton Hearn. And again, this is a first-term MP, but she's quite well connected with the Liberal Party. She was previously the, I believe, Director for Media and Communications for Stephen Marshall. Stephen Marshall being the last Liberal Premier of South Australia who lost the 2022 election. And it feels interesting, like when you look at these 3 new leaders, I mean, Ashton Hearn being a presumptive next leader of the South Australian Liberals. We won't know if she's actually going to get elected that spot for a couple of days, but assuming that she does take over the reins after Tarzia, does it feel like And I'm not in any way questioning the qualifications of these women as leaders of their respective parties. But, like, does it feel like every Liberal state branch got the exact same memo in how they should appeal to their electorates better? Because, look, I am not in any way questioning their qualifications. These three women all have extensive work either like adjacent to government with political parties in their private sectors, some of them being CEOs. These are people that are qualified to lead political parties. Plenty of men have led political parties with less experience and less of a resume. But does it not seem weird that not one, not two, but three different political parties, different branches, state-level branches of the Liberal Party, in the span of 3 weeks, all ditched their poorly polling leaders for first-term female MPs? Because I find it interesting, as a former Liberal, looking at the current situation all across the country in terms of what the Liberal branches are struggling with, is these branches seem to be doing exactly what I would tell them to do if I was giving them advice. That would be address the fact that your party, since Scott Morrison, has a massive problem with appealing to female voters, as you've seen with the absolute destruction of the moderate wing by teal independents, who represent women having power in politics in response to what Scott Morrison was. And on top of that is the fact that all three of these women are first-term MPs, which I think is a massive strength for them. Because if you're trying to separate yourself from the Liberal brand, the one that has been poisoned more or less since 2022, the ability to say, I am new and I'm here to shake things up and not do things the way that the Liberals used to, I think that is a massive benefit, particularly in this political environment, if Liberals want to start winning elections again. It is such a fascinating point of contrast, because we're now seeing state branches, at least in part, changing up their leadership to try and address the enormous problem that they have with female voters. And to give you a sense of how bad that problem is, I saw a man from Redbridge, the polling organization, say recently that Gen Z women are voting 44% for the Greens as their first preference, with Labour taking up most of the rest of that. So the Liberal Party, particularly amongst women and young women, is next to extinct. So to see some state-level branches at least getting the memo that they need to make the change or else they're heading towards electoral oblivion is kind of hilarious when you look at what the federal party is doing and seemingly putting all its efforts towards ensuring the first ever federal female leader of the Liberal Party doesn't even last a year. So will this move to Ashton Hearn, which is seemingly a foregone conclusion according to what the ABC is reporting in terms of whispers within the South Australian Liberal Party, is that going to be enough to help them win the next election? Absolutely fucking not. No chance at all. I feel like New South Wales and South Australia, it's kind of a similar situation, which is that their changing of leadership is not done in the hope that they will win the next election, but rather that they'll do slightly better than if their respective leaders, Mark Speakman and Vincent Tarzia, had stayed in place. Because, look, we don't actually know that much about Hearn or how she would potentially lead the party. There's no guarantee she would go much more moderate, considering that a lot of the insane, by my estimation, hard right factional leaders like Antic make their home in South Australia. I don't know how much she could change the ship, but realistically, it's quite funny thinking that this shake-up, if it does improve the Liberals' chances, we're talking about the situation going from the Liberals maybe being reduced to 3 seats to maybe winning 4 or 5 if they're lucky. Because I have to get this point across. Anything the South Australian Liberal Party does now is a desperate last-minute Hail Mary, just doing anything to try and shake up the state of the electorate before the next election. Because I'm not joking here. Looking at the current polling in South Australia, it is entirely possible that the South Australian Liberal Party suffers a defeat equal to or worse than what the West Australian Liberals went through in 2021. And that may sound extreme, but so is the insanity of the South Australian Liberal Party at the moment.